And suddenly, things went left on the boulevard. This was Sussex 2 State Prison, a level 4, Commonwealth of Virginia. And since then, it's been closed down. Side note, if you were up there and you made it off, I'm glad you did. I mean that. We were in a chow hall, and I remember a couple of individuals starting to mumble or whisper. At least I remember this in hindsight after the fiasco had occurred. Because while you're in there eating your chow on a level 4, the main thing that you focus on, aside from the fact that the food tastes horrible, is the officer that's pointing a weapon at your head in case anything pops off. It was that type of environment. And when we exited the chow hall, there were officers over top pointing weapons down at us as well. This was the standard protocol anytime there were inmates, better known as prisoners, on the boulevard. While we were being moved on the boulevard, we were moved from one corral cage system to the next. It was a bullpen to bullpen system, if you will, because we were not allowed to engage or interact with any of the other pods or prisoners in the other pods because, well, things could go left. And as we made our way to the final bullpen, just before we got to our housing unit, the building of which our pod was in, everything went crazy. Suddenly, there was a young man standing over top of an older gentleman with weapon in his hand, striking him, screaming out loud, "You know what you did." And I'll tell you this, I found out not too long after, when we finally made it back into the building after dozens of officers from God knows where on that institution, because they always said it was shortage of staff, showed up on the boulevard to break up the situation before it got all the way, to the point that it could have. Side note, the older individual was able to make it off, but the reality of the reason for that incident occurring was because that older gentleman years ago had taken the younger man's father's life. And the younger man had grown up after losing his father when he was a child and unfortunately ended up in prison. And I have to say, this highlights a unfortunate system that occurs when certain tragedies occur or a young person goes through loss and trauma isn't processed, because data shows that they can end up in prison. And unfortunately and ironically at the same time, the individual that ended up in prison, the young man, would end up in the same housing unit of the gentleman that took his father's life. Think about that. I often sit here and ponder and contemplate about the reality of, can one escape karma? Seeds planted, and then I think about that story right there. But that's not where it stopped. Because as the officers swarmed down to disrupt and basically in that situation before that young man ended the older gentleman who had taken his father's life. And can you imagine what was going through his mind? Because at the same time, the young man had been in the block for about 2 or 3 days and had sat back, studying, lurking, plotting, just waiting for the perfect time. And he thought that that would have been the perfect time. And from me doing time, I would say so, because when you were in the dorm or in the block, well, you had an officer in a tower that had a weapon that was, well, capable of dispersing of the situation almost immediately. But the place where he was able to inflict the attack, or decided to at that moment, on the boulevard, well, that was a place where no officer with weapon was right there immediately. Only an officer that walked with us, and at best they had mace, and that's only doing but so much. When the officers came out to disrupt that fight, what had occurred was an individual who was then at the time the imam of the Muslim community, and one of his brothers had, I don't know if they planned this or not, or maybe they just seized an opportune moment, had ran through the kitchen onto a dock where certain supplies were being loaded off of a supply truck, a semi truck, if you will. And they were able to get into the semi truck. Think about this. Wherewithal, or just the simple reaction or the responsive mindset to say, all the officers are occupied, this is our opportunity to get up out of here, let's go. Whatever or however occurred, it did in that moment. And they made it onto the semi, and just as they were getting ready to pull off, one simple thing or fact that they overlooked, at least this is how the story that was told, that got back to me as we sat inside of the cells on lockdown. They didn't know how to disengage the air brake. That was it. And who's to say if they disengaged the air brake, they would have been able to actually escape? Because I will tell you, Sussex 2 was surrounded by nothing but miles of woods, land, and Sussex 1. That's it. That's all that was out there. So I don't know if they would have gotten away. But ironically enough, one of the most annoying officers on the camp was able to stop them because they were not able to disengage the brake and get away. And some of the officers, once they had broke up that situation on the boulevard, had made their way onto the dock as the officer was frantically screaming for backup and was awarded for thwarting the escape attempt. Side note, that was like my second week in prison, literally. And what would happen immediately after is we would get put on lockdown for 3.5 weeks straight, 3.5 miserable weeks straight, where the food, at least breakfast, didn't come till 1 or 2 p.m. Dinner didn't come till midnight. It was always cold. Officers were disgruntled. They shook us down multiple times. And man, it was just so much. It was a lot going on. I learned how to fish. I'm just sitting here just really recollecting on all that, man. Prison is a traumatic place. There's some times where it's funny and it's lighthearted and it's just life, but man, there are other times where it's just, how did I make it through? And maybe that wasn't that situation for me, but still, to survive in the midst of that all, and that's just a glimpse. Stick around, I got more stories. Stay free. Peace.